Wonderful to see you here. Welcome to United Nations Youth and History Association Nepal. This is our Nepalese youth home. Chief guest of experience and orientation about the UN system and discussion about the about a book Lost in Transition program, Mr. Kulchandra Gautam, former Assistant Secretary General of United Nations and Executive Director of UNICEF. Mr. Tomo Hujumi, Head of UNICEF Nepal, distinguished representative of the UN agency. Dear young friends, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to welcome you all this program. Thank you for your gracious presence. Nepal is in protected political transition. It makes me feel really bad. About the present political and social economic condition of our country, there is still big gap among the people in the name of caste, gender, and social discrimination. Most of the youth are very pessimistic about the country. They are frustrated due to unemployment, corruption, social insecurity, political instability, among others. So they go about in search of a better life. However, as there is silver lining in every dark cloud, I have a kind attitude. I am quite interested in the old politics. I often read books in my leisure time. They all have faced the same situation that Nepal faces today. So I am equally optimistic about our country. We are rich in natural resources and it could be among the richest country in the world. But what we lack is vision management of social resources. We have a team of multi-dynamic personalities with the executive team of UNICEF. We are aware of politics, social economics changing the world. As we want to contribute for the development of our country, we always look for gaining more and more knowledge about the global leadership and development from UNICEF. I could gain the theoretical and practical knowledge about the different cultures, society, and global leadership, which I could utilize for the development of our country. At the same time, I have an intense social experience with new friends from around the world and found the lifelong relation I made. I want to work with all the police youth because I believe that young friends have the energy and idea we need to change our country. Dear friends, former Assistant Secretary General of United Nations and Executive Director of UNICEF, Mr. Kulchandra Gautam, and Head of UNICEF Nepal, Mr. Tomo will speak later. He is dynamic and inspiring. I am confident he will help young people understand the United Nations and incorporate the ideas of our world. Be part of creating the new visions. Warm welcome to you all once again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Now, I would like to invite Mr. Madan Rai, Vice President of United Nations Youth and Student Association Nepal, UNISAN, and moderator of this discussion. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Kulchandra Gautam to join our moderator for the comprehensive discussion.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and others, and my dear friends. It's my great honor to be moderator of Mr. Kulchandra Gautam. It was 1949, December 1, a miracle happened in Gulmi, Amarpur. A newly born boy was there, and his name was Kulchandra Gautam. He went to Banaras, took some education, came back to Nepal, again he studied, and his father wanted to make him a great Pandit. Unfortunately, he became assistant Secretary General of United Nations. And he is none other than Mr. Kulchandra Gautam, and he changed his name into Kulchandra Gautam later, and he was Kulchandra Gautam, and he wanted to be. His parents wanted to make him a Pandit, but he became the first highest ranked person in United Nations. That's not a joke. Ladies and gentlemen, it's like a dream come true. And it's my honor to welcome Mr. Kulchandra Gautam, and I wish, if I could, you all will stand and give him a standing ovation for his great achievement. Thank you so much. Mr. Kulchandra Gautam was the 6th topper of SLC batch and 2nd topper of maybe IA in Fisher. Then after he got a scholarship, but he was rejected by our foreign ministry to give him passport. And his file was passed to minister, and minister could not solve that, and King, maybe Mahendra took his file, again he rejected. And he is the man, Kulchandra Gautam. He started his service in United Nations in 1973 as intern, and later on he became the first highest ranked person in United Nations. Imagine a person started as intern and become the 3rd highest ranked person. And he is the man who studied in the Dartmouth University for international relations, and later he joined Princeton University for economics. And let's hear from him about his experience and UN system. Please welcome to Mr. Kulchandra Gautam.
Work?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Madanji, those were very warm words, and I want to thank you. And let me thank all the colleagues here from the United Nations Student Association of Nepal for organizing this event and asking me to share some thoughts. What a memorable day today. You know, the title of my book is Lost in Transition. An example of that is what happened today. We have a Bandh. For what? No particular reason. What a great cause? We don't know. And so this is where our country is lost. In transition, forever, without any particular reason. Anyway, but the first part of our session today, Madanji and Prakashji have asked me to talk about the United Nations. A little bit of an introduction to the UN for our colleagues, and let me say how happy I am to see young people interested in the work of the United Nations. It is so vital, so important, because we live in a global village. And we are, first and foremost, citizens of Nepal, but we are actually the citizens of the world. All of us are citizens of the world. And so it's important that we understand how the world works and the role of the United Nations, because the United Nations is an indispensable part of the global order of things these days. Now, because you have been with the UN, the association, Youth and Student Association, I'm sure you have read a lot about the UN. These days it is so easy to get information about the UN. You can go on the internet and you get all the information. I'm sure you have read the Charter of the United Nations. So I will not really talk about what you can easily read in your internet and other places. I will talk about the parts of the United Nations that you cannot read easily about, based on some experience. I thought that might be of some interest to you. But before I talk about the United Nations, actually my presentation today is going to be on myths and realities of the United Nations. There's a lot of myth. Many people imagine the UN is something that it actually is not. The reality is quite different from the myth. So I want to talk about the myths and realities, but before that, I would like to talk a little bit about Nepal and the UN. Because we are all Nepalis, I suppose most of us here, and Nepal has been a member of the United Nations now, this year, for 61 years. And because it happened so long ago, many of the young people don't have any idea as to how did Nepal get into the UN. Was it simple? Was it easy like all other member states? No. It's a very interesting story. Part of the reason why the Nepalese are very fond of the UN. We like the UN. We admire the UN. We love the UN. UN is our organization. We have a special feeling of ownership for the UN. You could say that happens, the UN has 193 countries. Doesn't everybody feel like that? No. For Nepal it is special. Why is it special? We need to go back to the beginning. Nepal, to become a member of the UN was not easy for Nepal. It was not simple, it was not straightforward. Remember when the UN was established in 1945, there were 50 founding members. Nepal was not one of them. Nepal did apply for membership soon after the founding of the United Nations. Actually, the first membership application for Nepal was submitted by Prime Minister Mohan Shamsher in the late 1940s. And Nepal's request to become a member was rejected. The United Nations, there was a veto in the Security Council saying, sorry, Nepal does not qualify to be a member of the UN. Maybe most of you probably did not know about this. Why? Remember, in those days, the world, UN had just been established, the world had two big superpowers. It was the Cold War. And the veto-wielding powers, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, they can decide to accept, or even a single country can veto. Veto power means if one country, one of the 5 says no, it is no. And at that time, the Soviet Union vetoed against Nepal. The Soviet Union said, Nepal does not qualify to be a member. Why? Because many people at that time thought that perhaps Nepal was a part of India or a satellite of India and did not really deserve to be an independent country. And India itself was not independent. India was part of the British Empire. So Nepal's membership request was rejected. Nepalese were very sad because they thought that the international community does not recognize us as an independent sovereign nation. So we kept trying and trying. No, we are independent. Then the Rana system was overthrown, democracy came, the democratic governments applied for membership, rejected. It was only in 1955, in December, that finally Nepal managed to become a member of the United Nations. And the Nepalese were cheering and celebrating. What a fantastic joy it was. So it was not easy for Nepal to become a member. That is why we appreciate being a member. And Nepal immediately gave enormous emphasis and importance to being a member of the UN. So, for example, our earliest ambassadors to the United Nations, they are called the permanent representatives, they were very senior people. The first Nepalese ambassador was a former Prime Minister, Matrika Prasad Koirala. A former Prime Minister was the ambassador. Then there were other very prominent people. There was Rishikesh Shah, a very well-known scholar. He had been minister. Then there was a very senior general, Padma Bahadur Khatri. He also held the rank of a minister. And then we had Shailendra Kumar Upadhyay, who was a foreign minister, a very senior political person. So you see, Nepal's ambassadors were not just ordinary career diplomats, they were very senior people. Very few countries assign such senior people to represent them. Why? Because we cherish the United Nations. Being a member of the UN, we are so proud, we are so happy. We wanted to make the best contribution we could make. And guess what? In the early years, those big personalities, the ambassadors from Nepal, made a very good contribution to the working of the UN. Not just concerning matters of Nepal, on world stage. What were some of the big issues at that time that the UN dealt with? One was decolonization. Remember, at that time, many countries were colonies. And there was a movement to make them independent in Africa, in Asia. So Nepal played a very important role in the decolonization committee of the United Nations. The UN is supposed to deal with peace and security, disarmament. Nepal played an important role in disarmament committee. Nepal also played a very important role, and at that time, a big issue in the UN was apartheid in South Africa. And many people say, why does Nepal care about apartheid in South Africa? South Africa is so far away, we don't have any relationship with them. No, we wanted to be a global player. We are not just a local Asian, South Asian player. We are a global player. We wanted to show that we can play, we can make a contribution. So Nepal actually was a vice chair of a UN committee dealing with apartheid. So decolonization, disarmament, apartheid is big issues. And then in the late 1960, there was a terrible plane accident. The Secretary General of the United Nations at that time was a man named Dag Hammarskjöld, a Swedish guy, one of the most dynamic, one of the greatest leaders of the United Nations. He died in a plane crash in the Congo, where there was a big war going on. It was a little mysterious. Was that a real accident? Or was there a conspiracy? Was there terrorism? What happened? So there was a big international commission to investigate what happened. How did Dag Hammarskjöld die? And guess who became the chairman of that committee, international committee? Rishikesh Shah of Nepal. He did a very good job. And he became so well respected. What? Nepali diplomat, very capable, very competent. People were very proud. In fact, his name was mentioned as a potential candidate to become the Secretary General of the United Nations to succeed Dag Hammarskjöld. Unfortunately, he didn't make it. There are many reasons why Nepalese have not made it all the way to the top. But Rishikesh Shah almost made it. There were a few, actually, domestic problems. Part of the problem at that time was that the king did not want another Nepali to be in a shining international position. So actually, although there was a lot of international support for him, Nepal itself was a little shy. We did not really support him. So he did not become. So instead, that was Asia's turn. So the Secretary General of the United Nations became Bhutan of Burma. A Nepali almost had become at that time, after Dag Hammarskjöld. So you can see that the United Nations was very important. Then, because we wanted to play an important role, as early as 1958, 2 years after we had joined the UN, Nepal said, we want to participate in peacekeeping operations. So Nepal volunteered and provided its soldiers to go and join peacekeeping operations. And ever since 1958, Nepal has been a very active member state in providing peacekeeping troops for wars all over the world, in Asia, in Africa, in any trouble spots. And guess what? At one point, Nepal was the 4th largest contributor for peacekeeping. Right now, I think it is 6th largest. So 4th, 5th, 6th, that's very important because Nepal is a relatively small and poor country to be able to be number 4, number 5 in the United Nations. So Nepalese have earned a very good reputation at the UN in peacekeeping area. And then let me talk about how about the UN in Nepal. Of course, UN agencies started coming to Nepal in the late 50s, early 60s, and they made a useful contribution for Nepal's development. Nepal received a lot of technical assistance, material support for all kinds of development activities in agriculture, in education, in child survival, in health, a variety of issues. Although the UN support was not a big in terms of money, it was very valuable technical assistance. So the Nepalese very much appreciated UN support in Nepal. But we were not only just begging, we were also contributing to United Nations work globally. So it was a two-way street, not a one-way street. So as you can imagine, Nepalese are very proud of our role in the UN, and the UN recognizes that. Moving fast forward, many decades of collaboration with the UN, precisely because we regarded the UN so highly, respected it as a true friend of Nepal. So during the Maoist conflict in Nepal, when the insurgency, terrible violence and war went on for 10 years, there were many countries that were offering help to Nepal to try to solve the conflict. Norway wanted to offer help, Switzerland wanted to offer help, the Carter Center wanted to offer help. There were many organizations and many countries who wanted to offer help to Nepal to end the conflict and to bring about peace. But we said, no thank you. We want the United Nations. Because United Nations is our organization. They don't have any personal interest. So we actually, I used to be at the United, I was a Karmachari of the UN. I was not representing Nepal. But I personally took the occasion to advocate for the UN's role in bringing about peace, ending the conflict in Nepal. And indeed, the UN was invited. First, Kofi Annan used to be the Secretary General. He played an important role. He offered his good offices to end the conflict in Nepal. Then we saw that when we wanted to invite the UN, our immediate neighbors were not supportive. India did not want the UN to be involved. China did not want the UN to be involved. The king did not want the UN to be involved. So it was despite reluctance and reservation by our own government at that time, by our neighbors, India and China both, but we still wanted the UN, and the UN finally came. First, the UN came in the form of the High Commissioner for Human Rights representation in 2005. Some of us quietly hoped to make sure that because there was a lot of human rights violations by both sides, by the Maoists and by the Nepal Army and the Nepal Security Service. Lots of people were suffering. The High Commissioner for Human Rights did a very good job. They were very impartial. And do you want me to stop or?
Yeah, I think we have limited time, so I want to make clear about another topic as well. Maybe our participants may be wishing to know that, like most of the people think that United Nations is just a soft weapon of powerful countries.
Yeah.
Right? The powerful countries say that we are providing the money and other poor countries are just feed it and they are just taking advantage. Exactly what is the reality? Either poor countries are really just getting too much benefit out of the money contributed by the rich countries, or it is really contributing as a soft weapon of the powerful nation. What is the myth behind?
Very good question. There are many misperceptions about the UN. one of the big misperceptions is that the UN must be a world government. It is not. The United Nations is not a world government. And many of us think that, oh, UN must be very powerful. UN has very limited power. We must be aware of its limitations. And then there are these perceptions. Some people say in Nepal, in many poor countries, oh, the UN, like you said, it's just a puppet of the United States. It's just a puppet of the big powers. It will do what the big powers ask it to do. It does not really care for the poor countries. So there is that kind of a perception. I remember during the time of the peace process here, when I used to come and used to deal with the various parties in Nepal, some of our leftists, particularly Maoists, said, oh, UN is okay, but aren't they a little tool of the United States and other superpowers? But guess what? If you go to America and ask American people, do you know what they say? The UN is very anti-US. UN is actually used by these poor developing countries. They have a majority in the General Assembly. They will vote, say, oh, the UN should provide us this help in health and agriculture, everything, pass a big budget, and get the rich country to pay for it. So it's easy to get them to UN because they have a majority. So, and not only that, many people in the rich countries, in Germany, in Japan, in the UK, etc., ordinary people, quite a few of them feel that the UN uses money from the poor and middle income taxpayers of the rich countries, provides to these poor countries where the rich people in these poor countries are engaged in corruption. So this is taking money from the poor of the rich countries and giving to the rich of the poor countries. So why should we support the UN? It does not serve the US interest. So, but you know, the reality is neither of those are actually correct. There's a partial truth to them. The UN tries to be objective. The UN tries to offer support. But you know, the greatest contribution of the UN is in being an honest broker, not siding with this group or not siding with that group, trying to find common ground. And I can talk a little bit about what kind of common grounds it has found. But how do you want to proceed?
Please.
So if you look at the UN, what are some of the UN's achievements and what are some of its failures? Among the achievements of the UN are that, you know, during the time when the UN was founded, unfortunately there was the Cold War. Many young people may not even know what the Cold War. Cold War was a big deal between the Soviet Union and their empire and the Americans and their empire, and they were at loggerheads, not trusting each other, trying to dominate, one trying to defeat the other. And precisely because in the international community, the world was divided between East and West, the communist bloc and the capitalist bloc. Anytime the UN wanted to do something, one or the other power will use their veto and not allow. The people did not want the UN to be powerful. For example, the Secretary General of the United Nations. That's a big personality. It is the highest diplomat in the world. You would think that he would have a lot of power. No, the big powers don't want a very dynamic Secretary General. They want a docile Secretary General. You know the word Secretary General? The big countries want a secretary, not a general. So the Secretary General has to be a very humble person. So, but despite that, what the UN has done is that in so many countries, when there have been wars, when there have been conflicts, the UN has, in many, many cases, prevented conflicts, helped in the post-conflict reconstruction and development. That's a very significant achievement. One more thing I should say. The UN has enacted, through consensus among countries, rich and poor, north and south, east and west, more than 300 international conventions on human rights, on protection of refugees, on the rights of children, on the rights of women. And thank God, because of that, we have some international norms that guide us. Otherwise, local tyrants, local dictators, could oppress people. No, today, we are all alert. There are human rights that are internationally agreed to. So that is a very significant contribution, setting norms that apply to every country. You cannot say, I'm a powerful country, I'm not going to agree with that. If you sign that treaty, you are supposed to follow that. So very important contribution. So among the areas I would say UN has made a contribution, coming up with these international norms, preventing conflicts, sending in the blue berets who help keep peace, and of course the most important for countries like us is development goals. We used to have the Millennium Development Goals, now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. And thank God we have these internationally agreed goals, because with them we are able to mobilize resources for all countries of the world. Many creative ways, and the UN has taken the lead. So these goals don't belong to this country or that group of countries. But don't throw the baby with the bathwater, because that's only the Security Council. I would say that for countries like Nepal, what are the most important functions of the UN? It is their help in health and agriculture and governance and labor and education, cultural preservation, environmental protection. There, I think you will find the UN not prejudiced, not biased, and even on the work of the Security Council, the superpowers don't always get what they want, because there is a competition among them. Some things that the US supports, Russia can veto. Something that the Russians like, the UK might veto. So there is some balance. So there is not as much arbitrariness as we think. So on balance, I would say the UN is a special friend of poor countries, smaller countries, which goes out of its way to give them even higher priorities.
Mr. Gautam, you have been a think tank for setting agendas, strategies in Security Council. So, what do you think is Security Council is a loophole for United Nations, that only powerful countries are exercising their power? Have you ever felt like that? Or as there are just 15 members, right? And 5 permanent members. So, did you feel something like that? Something is going here and there?
Well, I would say that my work with the Security Council was primarily limited to, because I used to be with UNICEF, with children, and the kinds of issues that the Security Council deals with concerning children are children and armed conflict. When, like in Nepal, we had the Maoists used a lot of child soldiers. That is wrong. It's against the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the fact that the UN Security Council came up with a policy on children in armed conflict, that we must not allow that, that's a good thing for countries like Nepal. It is not just in the interest of the Soviet Union or Russia. It is in the interest of countries like Nepal and other conflicts. So that's one area in which the Security Council, my work involved. Another area was HIV/AIDS. When HIV/AIDS became not just a health issue, but a major security issue in the world, and when women and children were being impacted, the UN Security Council exceptionally, it does not involve war and peace, but it was worse than war. So UN took a very enlightened position on HIV/AIDS. Third area that I was involved in was how do we make sure that in the UN peacekeeping and other operations, women participate actively. There's several Security Council resolutions requiring countries that contribute UN peacekeeping troops to make sure that there are women. That's a good thing for countries like ours. This is not in the interest of superpower, it is in our interest. So there are many things that the Security Council does that we can be proud of. They are in our interest. The fact that they have veto power, never mind, because on matters concerning us, most matters the Security Council is with us, is our friend.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gautam. And I would like to go for a question from our participants. So please, participants. So question passed.
Collection.
Yes. Shall we have the mic? Yes, please. Okay. Yes.
Hello, sir. I am actually a student of environmental science, and I have a question from SDG.
Yeah.
So I want to know if you can explain about SDG goals in UN, and can SDG be studied, and does this subject provide scope for students in Nepal or not? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Do I take several questions?
Yeah, maybe we have to go through. If there are similar kind of question, please
You can
find
just
out,
summarize
because
it.
he has got very limited time. So please, if any other question relating to SDG. Please raise your hand if you have just raised the question regarding the SDGs. No question? Okay, thank you, sir. You are asking for the SDGs.
Yeah. Well, I would say that one of the great things that the United Nations has done is setting global goals around which all countries can unite. Because until we had, I would say 1990, before 1990, in terms of what are the development priorities. Nepal had its priorities, Zimbabwe had different, Peru had others. There was nothing unifying this country. So we could not mobilize combined global support. Then in 1990, UNICEF, I was deeply involved in, organized the World Summit for Children. That set these goals for reducing infant mortality, reducing under 5 mortality, maternal mortality, malnutrition, promoting education, sanitation, specific goals that all countries of the world agreed to. And that created an atmosphere for great solidarity. And actually those goals in the 1990s were quite successful. Even in Nepal, our immunization rates in the 1980s were 5% of the children used to be immunized. This got to 10%. By the end of 1990, we reached, by the end of 2000, we reached over, now immunization rates are over 95%. Our under 5 mortality rate has gone down. Maternal mortality rate has gone down. Fertility has gone down. So this was possible because we could mobilize global support because they were shared goals. Not only Nepal, no, so did Papua New Guinea, so did Zimbabwe, so did Peru, Bolivia, all of them, and donors were asked to support us. It was very important. Then, based on the success of the children's goal in the 1990s, when it came to 2000, we said, let us be even more ambitious. Then we came up with the Millennium Development Goals, going beyond children to a number of other areas. And these goals were embraced by even more countries. And if you say from 2000 till 2015, everywhere, wherever you went, governments, development workers talk about MDG, MDG 1, MDG 2, MDG 3. Everybody knew what the MDG were. Never before were there goals that everybody identified, knew. And then today we have the Sustainable Development Goals, going even beyond that. Because MDGs and the children's goals, those were goals appropriate for that time. But the world had changed. For example, what is unique in the SDGs that was not in the MDGs? In the MDGs we talked about reducing such and such by 50% or 2/3 or 1/3. But now we are driven by a human rights approach. That means universal access. Nobody should be left behind. So reducing poverty not by half, but eliminating absolute poverty. So I think the world is mobilizing. Equity has become a big issue, part of the millennium. Environment was not there in the MDG. It was there in a minimal kind of way. Today it has become a big thing. And precisely because the sustainable development encompasses a broad range of goals, there is opportunity for all of us to participate. Earlier you could say, well, this MDG is okay, but I'm interested in something that is not contained in the area. Today, whatever your area of interest, the SDGs are relevant. There is a room for you to contribute. There is a room for you to participate. There is a room for you to make an influence. So I think the SDGs are a welcome development that unites the world. And for the next 15 years, we'll be talking SDGs, mobilizing resources. And important thing is, we also not only set it, sometimes it is said that the UN ever sets the goals but never meets them. But we now are developing a very robust monitoring system, a data revolution that is being called, whereby countries have to report. They will be measured. How is this country doing compared to the neighboring country? So, for example, Nepal is doing very well in some of the social indicators. We're doing very poorly in terms of infrastructure and economic development compared to many other countries. So we will be under a microscope. Nepal, get your act together. Improve your infrastructure. Improve your economy. Because otherwise, some of the gains you have made in the social development might not sustain. So I think SDGs are a wonderful platform for all countries and all peoples to unite, and they create opportunity so nobody will be left behind. You have a place in the SDGs, you have a place, all of us have a place in the SDGs.
Thank you, Mr. Gautam and Ashra Kunar. Shall we have a next question?
Namaste sir, I'm Diksha Karki. Countries like India along with Germany and other countries are asking for the permanent membership in the Security Council of United States. Do you think that they should be given the veto power? And also, what do you think, as a diplomat, should Nepal be supporting India or not, especially considering the recent unofficial blockage by India? In summary, do you think the veto power should be extended or not?
Thank you.
This is a subject of big debate in the UN for decades. There has been in the UN for several decades now a committee to look at the reform of the Security Council. Many people are unhappy with the way the Security Council works today. The Security Council, with the veto powers, had a good justification in 1945. Because at that time, if some of the big powers, for example the US, if they had not been given the veto power, they would not have joined the UN. And if they had not joined the UN would have been useless, would not be able. Like the League of Nations. Remember, in the 1920s, after the First World War, there was the League of Nations. And US was not a member of the League of Nations, although US played an important role. Precisely because the US was not a member, League of Nations collapsed. If there had not been veto power, that the big countries, powerful countries, economically and military power, if they did not feel that UN protects our interest, the UN would have collapsed. So there was a good reason in those days to have veto-wielding permanent members. However, that was 70 years ago. In the last 70 years, so many things have changed. The world has changed. Some of the big powers at that time are no longer big powers. There are new big powers like China and India and Germany and Japan. Germany and Japan defeated in the war. So the Security Council today is still the Security Council of 1945. We need a Security Council of 2016. And if we were to create a Security Council here, today, in the era of democracy, greater equality, I don't think today we would want any country to have veto power. What is being done for the reform of the Security Council? As I said, there are many, many proposals. Some saying, okay, let us correct partially the inadequacies of 1945 by bringing China and Brazil and India and a couple of countries from Africa, Nigeria, so that it will be more balanced. There is some logic to that because these big countries play an important role in peace and security. However, in this day and age, you don't want double standards. Some countries to be superior to others. And therefore there are also proposals saying the whole veto system should be abolished. However, the charter, if you read the Charter of the United Nations carefully, you will see that the charter is drafted in such a way that in order to get rid of veto power, those veto-wielding powers have to support you, and they will never support giving up there. So forget about getting rid of the veto unless you want to create a new United Nations, which is not realistic. However, there are some very good proposals. So for countries like India,
And
I would
Germany.
say India, Germany, Brazil, Japan, I would say some of those big powers should have greater say in the Security Council. But I would say without a veto power. In fact, among the many, many proposals for reform of the Security Council, the proposal that I personally like most is by a good friend of mine. His name is Kishore Mahbubani, the former Singapore ambassador to the United Nations. Brilliant man. He has written a couple of books. He has a proposal for reforming the Security Council. His proposal is the following. Since you cannot get rid of the veto power without themselves agreeing, and they will never agree, what he suggests is a 777 formula, whereby you will have as permanent members the current 5, sorry, you cannot get rid of them. It's built into the Constitution, in the Charter. Add to them India, and maybe Brazil too, because we also want Africa is to be represented. So have 7 really permanent members, but the new ones without veto power. And then there are many middle powers. They are not the richest, they are not the most powerful, but they are very big players in the world. So middle powers, they should have 7 members. And how about poor countries, little countries like Nepal and the Pacific Islands? They also need to have their say. So let us create a seat for the small powers, 7 seats for them. And the 7 seats for them would rotate. The middle one would be it might last for 5 years instead of 2 years. That way, everybody gets a chance to be represented. It is not just countries represented, it's a group of countries, the least developed countries, or those categories of countries. I think if you did that, the UN would be a bit more democratic. Not fully democratic, but more democratic. Because remember one thing, the UN is like a mirror. It's the mirror of the world. It reflects the best of the world and the worst of the world. UN cannot be perfect. So what we need to create is a more perfect, not a perfect, but a more perfect, better functioning the UN. And Security Council reform is very important. I would say no more veto powers, but recognize the reality in the world, the realpolitik, as well as democratic aspirations of countries. So a 3-tier system, as proposed by Kishore Mahbubani. That's one proposal. There are many other proposals. That is my favorite proposal.
Okay, thank you. So we have next.
Namaste, I'm Krishna Acharya. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for the book Lost in Transition. It was nice to read it. And my question is related with conflict, as I am in a way related with the conflict, as my father was killed during the conflict. He was a journalist and a lecturer. And there was one curiosity always buzzing in my mind. And today I got the opportunity. And the question is, to what extent UN's right orientation instead of duty orientation helping to create conflict in the world as a whole?
Does the UN's emphasis on rights create more conflict? And
Instead of duty.
Instead of duty.
Duty orientation.
Yeah. Very good question. I would say that in the world there are human rights, universal human rights that belong to everybody simply because we are human beings. There is merit for those human rights. But the rights without duties is not a practical way to approach. So yes, indeed, there are actually several, not the UN adopted, but several civil society organizations have a charter of human duties, not just human rights. I think it is a good thing to have a list of duties because every right holder also is a duty bearer. So I think it's important to have, but I do not think that the rights approach advocated by the UN creates conflict. But it does create some misunderstanding. It does create, we see in quite a few countries, communities claiming rights for themselves, but forgetting, how about the rights of the other? As you claim your right, you must be mindful that your claim does not conflict with your right. So we have to have that sagacity, that wisdom, that my rights are important, but so long as I do not take away from another person's right. So that is the question of duty. I think you are absolutely right. I would not say that the focus on rights causes conflict, although it has caused some conflicts, particularly, for example, in the context of our federalism debate, or federalism debates in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet republics, in former Yugoslavia. There have been lots of conflict because people claiming their right have not been as mindful and supportive of other people's rights. So don't overdo it. Everything has to have some balance in life. Imbalance, claim for rights, and forgetting your duty or forgetting other people's rights is irresponsible. So I think that kind of a balance, you make a very good point, is needed, because otherwise we become very selfish. That this is my right, this is my right. And how about my duty? How about my protecting you to enjoy your rights? I think very good point.
Thank you, Mr. Gautam and Krishna Acharya. Shall I have another participant? Yes, here is Madan Rai.
धन्यवाद सर। सरलाई मेरो प्रश्न छ, 6 महिना भारतीय अमानवीय नाकाबन्दी हुँदा UN को पहल के थियो अथवा त्यो पहल किन प्रभावकारी रूपमा सञ्चालन हुन सकेन? धन्यवाद।
Yes, please. I would say that when there was the blockade, the international community was not as helpful to Nepal as it could be and as it should have been. Part of the reason being that the realpolitik of the world and many countries and many organizations wanted to keep their good relationship with India. They did not want to damage those relationships, and they were driven by those considerations, and the interest of a poor, small country like Nepal was not as high in their priority. However, I must say that the UN played a relatively better role than many other countries. For example, initially, on the constitution, the UN was very lukewarm, like India. But once the blockade started, Ban Ki-moon issued very clear and strong statement saying that Nepal's right to unrestricted access to the sea, to commerce, to trade should be respected, implying that it was not being respected. So I think I congratulate Ban Ki-moon. Some of us also helped him, because when the UN's first statement came, some of us quietly through our own channel said, "Hey UN, I don't think you are being fair." And I think the UN was responsive. So the UN did respond, but the UN alone does not have the power. I think a bigger problem was with some of the Western countries. They should have spoken more forcefully, and they were very wishy-washy. I must say, to the credit of the United Nations in Nepal, UNICEF, for example, came up with a very strong statement, not condemning India, but it says, because of the blockade, 1.6 million children in the Madan Rai are out of school. That's a violation of those children's rights. Wonderful. The UNICEF's executive director was visiting here. He made that statement. You cannot violate children's rights. So that was partly a message to our own revolutionaries, partly a message to India. But you are right. I think the UN was not as effective as it could have been. But compared to many others, UN did speak up, spoke with as a matter of a principle, but realpolitik is such that very few countries want it. It's very interesting. You know, when the European Union and Narendra Modi came up with that statement.
David Cameron.
And David Cameron came up with that statement. I know the local ambassador of the EU here. She personally was angry with India. She even, I can tell you this is not for public consumption, she even sent a message to Brussels saying this is a huge humanitarian crisis is being caused in Nepal. We must not be quiet. We must speak up. But Brussels did not listen to her. Why? Big trade interest between India and the EU. Same thing with the UK. So unfortunately, part of the reality of the world is that economic power, military power often speaks louder than humanitarian concerns. Unfortunately, that's why I say the UN is a mirror of the world. UN cannot be perfect. UN is as imperfect as you and I and all of us.
Okay, thank you. I hope Bali Hang's question is addressed. Shall we have next participants? I think with mic. Yeah. Yes. Avish.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Avish Ramchani. My question was, what initiatives were previously taken for the use of developing countries like Nepal, and how effective was that? What kind of plans or measures are being taken for youths in coming days?
Very good question. I would say that the UN talks a lot about the importance of youth participation. And I know in the next session, Tomo Huzumi will talk about exploring the role of the youth in meeting the objectives of UNICEF. But honestly, I think there's been a lot of lip service rather than actual activity. However, the voice of the youth is increasingly important. I was some time ago when I met with Madan Ji and Prakash Bandari Ji. I said that one of my first links with the UN, when I was involved, when I was a student, an undergraduate, on a study, the role of youth-related organizations in the working of the United Nations. So as far back as the 1970s, the UN was concerned about involving youth, but I think the UN has not been able to quite capture the imagination of youth. But I would say that increasingly, as you know from your experience, the UN is beginning to pay more and more attention. At the moment, much of the interest is with children, the younger group. Youth are a little difficult for the UN to handle, because children, you can love and cuddle and you can be nice to them and they will not fight back or argue back. Youth are very argumentative, and many diplomats don't want arguments, or they want arguments at their own level. So I think the UN has not been as strong in involving youth in the past. But I think the UN realizes today that if we are going to be a vibrant organization, UN needs to rejuvenate itself. Younger people have to participate, because otherwise the UN will be an old institution cut off from the life stream of society. And if you don't have young people, and increasingly you will see there are younger and younger people as goodwill ambassadors of the UN, as playing a various spokesperson's role. UN is reaching out to sports for development and peace, arts for development and peace, and that all involving younger people. And when it comes to concern for the environment, many of our old people don't know much about it, don't care. It's the young people who care about the environment. And so increasingly, I would say, the UN pays more attention. But I think young people themselves, you need to assert yourself and say, hey, listen to our voice. We have our views. Come up with ideas. And I think the UN will be receptive.
Okay, thank you. And we have many enthusiastic participants. They want to ask questions. So may I have next question? Okay.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Priyanka Khatioda, a student of public health, and my question is, we do appreciate the role of UN in the upliftment of health status of people in terms of financial and technology, but it's not that we indirectly are being more dependent to others than being self-reliant. Thank you.
Again, another good question. Tomo, welcome.
Mr. Tomo Ojumi is here, and I would like to call Mr. Prakash Banzade, President of Unisan, and Mr. Madan Rai, Vice President of Unisan, to welcome him.
To the question on health, I would say that of all the areas of UN's work, from war and peace to environment to culture to education and a whole lot of areas, the one area that I would say are of the greatest success are in health. I think the UN has played a very important role in the worldwide efforts, initially to eradicate smallpox, to eradicate polio, to combat nowadays, the Zika virus and all kinds of Ebola virus, etc. And because of that, the world has seen extraordinary changes. We are now entering what is called a demographic transition, whereby today the people of the world, children of the world, are healthier than ever before, any previous generation. Although every time we win some battle, some new battle come, unexpected diseases come, but mortality rates have gone down. So I would say that the UN has a very proud record in the field of health. And I'm not sure that I understood your question fully. Is it creating greater dependence? Is that what you're saying? Not really. I do not think so. I think that health is an area of the great, and no wonder. You look at the Millennium Development Goals. What were the most well-known goals? They were health-related. Even in the Sustainable Development Goals, health is dominating. Before that, as I said, we had the goals for children. Most of them were health-oriented. I think success in health area is the feather in the crown of the United Nations. And I think we must build on that and move on to making similar progress in education, similar progress in poverty reduction, similar progress in environment. And then nowadays, as we talk about in the Sustainable Development Goals, it is not just alleviating these things, it is reaching everybody with equity, the focus on equity. And again, in the health area, we are ahead of many others. In many other areas, the gap between the rich and the poor are much wider. In the health area, the gaps are becoming narrower and narrower. So I think that is an area of the UN's great achievement, and I hope that from the success of health, we'll be inspired to do more things in education, sanitation, environment, industrial development, a whole lot of other areas.
Okay, thank you. Shall we have next?
Thank you, Mr. Madan Rai, for giving me this opportunity. This is Ravindranath Patrai, Associate with the Nepal Council of World Affairs and Tribhuvan University. It is my great pleasure to be in front of such a huge personality, Kulchandra Gautam, who was representing Nepal as a Secretary General and ED of United Nations, as well as UNICEF, respectively, as well as Mr. Tomo Ojumi, head of UNICEF mission in Nepal, as well as my friends Rajendra Banipaliji, unique chief in UNDP building. I got this chance with my brother and friends, Mr. Narendra, who just suddenly met in front of UN office gate, and I just heard that Kulchandra Gautam is giving some presentation, and I entered here, irrespective of my work in Nepal Council of World Affairs. It's my great pleasure to be a part of this discussion as well as gaining more insights from your enlightened speech and remarks. First of all, though Mr. Tomo is giving the speeches on the exploring the role of youth, meeting the objective of UNICEF as well as the SDGs, Nepal is passing through a critical transition since, as Mr. Kulchandra Gautam said, that a demographic transition. Since this is the point a country faces in our lifetime once in a blue moon, similar huge resources, youth resources, we call it as a demographic dividend we are getting, but we are not using these resources. Since some of the earlier presentators or interactors asked to the Gautamji, is that there is unemployment, there is insecurity, we are not getting employment. If we see the indicators of either agriculture production or even cereal production, even other production, we are importing from other countries. Even the country is not giving priority to involve the youth for productive sectors. That's why I just want to know that if the huge personalities like Gautam and other personalities who are representing the international arena by Nepali people, they are not giving the pressure to the government that you should do as much as the people who can incorporate for the general upliftment through productivity or any other means so that the standard of living will be uplifted. This is one of my remarks. Another is that since you have written a book, a well-read book, not only in Nepal but all over the world, that still we are facing the problem. Since today is the close day also by Maoist, another faction of Maoists. Since we are always, in my opinion, that Nepal is going to be a guinea pig for testing the hypothesis of all kinds of intervention that would take place in future in all over the world. Is that a correct imagination or thinking I am proposing? If not, why the international community will sit together as a donor partner? If you do this, then we can give you the donation or production activities. If you do not fulfill these minimum requirements, then we will withdraw our donation and as well as the grant. Such a huge pressure will create the government that it will start working for the pro-people's activities.
I'm sorry, sir. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have limited time, so I'm sorry to interrupt you. Maybe his question was that why the personalities like you people are not doing your role possibly. And he gave many references. If you have any comments, please.
I would say that maybe that is a topic for our next discussion.
Yes. So shall we proceed further next?
When we
Shall
talk
we leave it?
specifically about Nepal. But I would just say this, two things. One is that I feel that when I think about the youth in Nepal, what a tremendous lost opportunity we have. Because at present, in my mind, there are two images of the youth of Nepal. On the one hand, you have youth organizations affiliated with political parties, very activist in their own areas, often not working in the national interest but only in the interest of their party. Whether it is the Young Communist League of the Maoists or the Youth Force of UML, of Tarun Dal, whatever groups, all of these young people, premature political activism, undue political activism. I think the example today is, what is this Bandh for? Utter nonsense. So, on the one hand. On the other hand, the other image you have of the youth is long lines of our youth in front of manpower agencies, in the passport office, in the Trivandrum airport, going for employment that are unsafe, that are not well paying, that make them vulnerable. And that is the image of the youth. And somehow I think our political leadership has not been able to really pay attention. Now, what can people like some of us who have some voice and say, unfortunately, I get the feeling that our political leadership is a bit immune from the pressure of individuals. It is not because they don't have ideas. Nepalese are well informed, but there seems to be a system that is immune to ideas. And in terms of donor pressure, that's a two-edged sword. If you want pressure in one area, you have to be prepared to accept pressure in other areas. You would not like that kind of pressure. So as a sovereign country, independent country, I don't think we want undue pressure from the donors, except when it comes to globally agreed norms. Because those are norms that I do not consider. If a donor said you are violating the rights of children, you are violating the rights of women, that to me is not interference in internal affairs, because those are universally agreed. Beyond that, to say you must run your country like this, you must invest in this, that is not appropriate for the international community. So be careful if we invite undue interference. You may like some, but there will be interference in other areas which we would not like. So it requires more caution. But you are right, I think at the moment, and we'll talk about it in the next session, we seem to be immune from any pressure. And Nepal is in a kind of autopilot mode whereby leaders do what they feel they need to do in their temporary interest for the country rather than the long-term interest. But we will talk about it later.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Kulchandra Gautam, and thank you, sir, for your question. And thank you, participants, and to the being of first discussion session. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. We'll be making a question be asked later in the next.